Okay, welcome history lovers. Today we're going to be learning about ancient Egypt on this PowerPoint lesson. First of all, let's take a look at the world map to see where Egypt is. You can see that Egypt is located in the continent of Africa. It's semi close to the equator. It's a desert region. And if you look a little bit closer, you can see that it's south of the Mediterranean Sea, it's west of the Red Sea, and the Nile River runs right through Egypt. And in talking about early civilizations, we know that the geography of any ancient civilization is very dependent on a river. So the Nile River was really the gift of life for the civilization of Egypt. Let's take a closer look at the Nile. You can see here from this satellite picture from space, the river here, it starts in the south and it flows north. That's a fun fact. And it empties out into the Mediterranean Sea at this delta. A delta is a fan shaped mouth of a river, not a fan like you plug into the wall, but a fan like you would use with your hand to fold and fan yourself. So, like a triangle shaped mouth of a river. And you'll notice that it looks from this picture from space, it looks green. And the reason that it looks green is not because the water is green. It's because you're not actually seeing the river here. You can see that it's shaped like a river. That's because the river is tiny and goes through here. But what you're seeing from space is the land that's getting water from that river. And so that is growth. It's vegetation. It's all sorts of the fertile soil around the river, and that's where things grow. The rest of this area, if you're familiar with northern Africa, is the Sahara Desert. So what you're seeing here in this picture from space is all of this arid land, all of this dry Sahara Desert, and then you see the green is the lush banks of the Nile River that is good for growing. When we studied about early civilizations, we learned that it's very important to have a river to have a civilization for farming and for irrigation and for drinking and for raising animals and for transportation. The river is so important to a civilization. So, like in Mesopotamia, when we learned about the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, Egypt, the ancient civilization survived because of the Nile River. Let's take a look. So, just like in other river valley civilizations, it flooded every year. And that provided fertile soil that was good for growing crops. Remember, in our last unit, we learned about that the word fertile means good for growing. It's a nice, rich soil full of nutrients for growing plants and raising crops. It was the lifeline of Egypt. It was a major transportation route, which became very good for the trading of different towns and different cities within the kingdom of Egypt, the different kingdoms. It was used for irrigation. Remember, in Mesopotamia, they also invented a system of irrigation to bring water to their crops, and that's what allowed for the agricultural revolution, where they could stop roaming from place to place to find food and instead stay in one area and irrigate their crops, raise their crops for food, and raise animals for food. The Nile River flows south to north, and the mouth is called a delta. What type of food would have they eaten in ancient Egypt? Well, the irrigation systems watered crops. They would have mainly had crops of barley, wheat, and flax. Those are the three major crops for ancient Egypt. The main food would have been bread and beer and fish. They would have had a number of vegetables and fruit, but only the wealthy would have been able to afford meat. And we'll talk a little bit about that in social classes as we move on. You can see here, this is what an Egyptian bread looks like. You're familiar with the pita bread. It's very much like a pita bread. Here's some wheat growing, and here's a system of irrigation, just like in Mesopotamia, where they dug trenches to deliver the water inland from the river to water their crops, and they would have a system of stops at the different places to stop the water from flowing and to reopen it for flowing. Social pyramid. Every early civilization started to specialize in their jobs, and early people started to become in different classes depending on their education and their wealth and where they were born. At the very top of the social pyramid would have been the king. And in Egypt, that was called a pharaoh. So royalty would be at the very top. Underneath that would be the high priests and noblemen, noble, wealthy, very wealthy men and women, and then priests, doctors, and engineers. So you can see there's a level of education here. Scribes, much like in Mesopotamia, scribes were very important to ancient Egypt as well because a written language was invented, and there were only certain people that could read and write. And if you could read and write, you may become a scribe. Craftsmen would have been under that. And at the bottom of the social pyramid, it would have been soldiers, farmers, and tomb builders. Some theories suggest that slaves might be under this. Some theories suggest that Egypt paid their workers. And so we'll leave it at that. So let's take a look at homes of ancient Egypt. Homes would have been built from the resources they had from the earth. So you have to take into account the geography of Egypt. There were not a lot of trees, there was not a lot of wood to use. Just like in ancient Mesopotamia, one thing that they had a lot of was clay and mud. So they would make mud bricks. And you can see here, this is they would use these shapes to make the shapes of their bricks, and they would lay the bricks up like this. Oftentimes there would be animal dung mixed in. There's a fun fact for you that you cannot unhear. So animal dung might be mixed into this to help bind those bricks. And you can see here, this is in modern day Egypt, and I can attest to the fact that they do still build a lot of their homes from mud bricks, just like they did in ancient days. And so they're building a home here with mud bricks. Some homes would have looked like this, some houses would have looked like this, but basically they used what they had for resources to build their homes. For language, just like Mesopotamia invented cuneiform, Egypt invented a language called hieroglyphics. And you can see here it was based on different shapes for the different sounds. And later on in the week, you will have an opportunity to write some hieroglyphics, write your name in hieroglyphics, maybe write a message in hieroglyphics. This is just to give you a taste of that. So every earliest civilization that formed around the earth invented a language, and Egyptians, theirs is known as hieroglyphics. Let's take a look at pharaohs. So we said earlier that the king of an Egyptian kingdom would be called a pharaoh. He was the ruler, or she was the ruler of the whole kingdom. The pharaoh was seen as a god. Everyone worshipped the pharaoh and also would have worked for the pharaoh. When he died, the Egyptians believed in the afterlife. So the pharaoh's body would be mummified and buried in a beautiful chamber along with his belongings, sometimes in a pyramid, which we will get into later. Like all civilizations, Egyptians had the need for laws. The pharaoh would be the supreme judge of that law, of what was right and what was wrong. So early civilizations also found the need for rules and laws and enforcement of those laws. Religion. The Egyptians believed in many gods. If you remember from our last unit of study on Mesopotamia, you might remember that the term for many gods would be polytheism. Poly meaning many, and theism meaning the belief in God. So Egyptians prayed to many different gods who controlled different things. If you're really interested in Egypt, there's a lot of books that I have in my classroom that you can read about the different gods and goddesses of Egypt and what each went with. But basically, Egyptians built temples and shrines to honor their gods. Lots of artwork had to do with religion, and Egyptians believed in an afterlife. They believed that when you died in this world, you would go on to another world and be reborn. Here are a few of the most common gods in Egypt. Anubis was the god of preserving the dead, Horus, the god of the sky, Osiris, the god of the dead and the underworld, and Ra, the god of the sun. Again, you could spend hours and hours learning about Egyptian gods and goddesses. The process of mummification. So Egyptians believed that when people die, they would move on to another world. So since their body would be needed in the afterlife, it needed to be preserved because we know that when we die, our body slowly decays and rots away. And the Egyptians knew that, but they came up with a process called mummification, in which they would preserve the body so that it would not rot away. And this process involved first removing the organs from the body, and those would go into jars called canopic jars. They would take the brain out, fun fact, through the nose. Don't forget to watch the videos I posted on this week's assignment. It's a very fascinating and disgusting process. They would then pack the body, the inside of the body, with natron. Now, natron is really just a solution of salt and baking powder. And that mixture would really dry out the body. And you'd have to stuff the body with it, wait several days, take it out, replace it with new natron, wait a few days, take it out, replace it with new natron, and so on. So after several weeks, they would apply, once the body had all been dried out, they would apply oil to the outside of the body, wrap the body in bandages, and place the body in a sarcophagus. And in this picture, you'll see a cartoon picture of a sarcophagus. They would then put a decorated mask on the body, and the body would be put in a chamber with all the things they would need for the afterlife. So when people found the tombs of ancient Egyptian kings, ancient Egyptian pharaohs, they also found lots of riches and gold and all sorts of pottery and all sorts of food. Even sometimes pets would be mummified and buried with their owner. So there's another fun fact for you. They would be buried with their pets. And of course, a pharaoh would be buried inside a pyramid. Here's one of the most famous pyramids. You can see the outer pyramid is what you can see when you see it from the outside, but you can see a number of passageways and chambers that were hidden inside this pyramid and blocked off so that robbers would not get in and rob all of the jewels and riches that would be buried here. So here is the king's chamber. This is where his sarcophagus and all his worldly goods would go, so that when he awoke in the afterlife, he would then wake up with all of the things he needed in his new life. And you can see the whole pyramid is basically a giant tomb to the pharaoh, a gravestone, a memorial to the pharaoh. Now, let's take a look at some of the contributions of Egypt. All of the ancient river civilizations invented and discovered things that helped us in modern day time, and the Egyptians were no different. We talked about their language being hieroglyphics. One of their famous contributions for architecture were the pyramids. They also invented a 365-day calendar. Sound familiar? We have a 365-day calendar. They invented a form of paper, the earliest form of paper, actually, and it was called papyrus. And here's actually a picture down here in the bottom right of papyrus that's drying. And they also invented an irrigation system to bring water to crops. They invented mathematics, different types of medicine, weapons, chariots. They had lots of different art. The Egyptians were very much into art, and they did a lot of things with statues and paintings and even jewelry. The women would have worn a lot of jewelry, and as the men actually would wear a lot of jewelry. Some other famous symbols of Egypt, King Tut, you can hear about him in this week's lessons in our videos. Queen Hatshepsut, the scarab beetle, amulets, which were good luck charms, and the Sphinx, which I put a video on this week's lessons for you to watch about the Sphinx. Cartouche is a area that you would do your hieroglyphics in. It's kind of the frame. The actual frame is called the cartouche. And the Eye of Horus is another famous symbol of ancient Egypt. Now, this week when you go through our lessons and our videos, make sure you are getting ready for your quiz. Here are some of the kinds of questions that might be asked on the quiz. You can also practice on Quizlet or quizzes as you see fit during the lessons. So I hope you enjoyed learning about ancient Egypt. This was just a quick overview, and of course you could really learn a lot about Egypt. We could spend weeks on Egypt if we had the time. But that's a small little lesson on Egypt that I hope you will do well on the quiz by watching this.